we're going to dive deeper into the neurobiology of grief that we explored in the Biology of Trauma podcast episode number 115 with Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. Grief is not just an emotional experience, it is a whole body biological process. And no wonder it affects so many of our different health symptoms. What I've discovered through both my personal journey and my work with patients and course members over the years, grief can be overwhelming. And it can be so overwhelming that it triggers our body's instinctual trauma response, not just stress response. When you think about your experiences with grief, where do you feel it in your body? It's often in our heart and our gut. And so, as I share in my book, The Biology of Trauma, our body experiences both stress and trauma, and grief can take us across what I call that critical line of overwhelm, where a challenge becomes too much. And I want to help you understand why grief feels the way it does in our body and how we can work with it differently, how we can support our biology, repair our biology, and use that as a way towards healing. Why does grief feel so unbearable? When one experiences grief, our body engages what are the three survival mechanisms of that trauma state when our body goes into that response. Those three survival mechanisms are across the board what we will experience when our body goes into the trauma response. And as it relates to grief, it's going to be the degree of dissociation, immobilization, and energy conservation. So, again, these are the three survival mechanisms of the trauma response, and they are going to be evident in every time that we go into a trauma response. But as we are speaking to grief, they are going to be dissociation, immobilization, and energy conservation. These often feel like weaknesses. They feel like we're stuck. They feel like we're falling apart. And yet, these are actually the sophisticated protections that our body uses to help us survive what feels unbearable. Let's look at dissociation first. I define dissociation as our body's ingenious way of creating distance from what would otherwise be too overwhelming to bear. When we think about distance, there's not just a physical distance, but there's an emotional distance, there's a mental distance. A person can dissociate to the degree that they feel that they're watching themselves from outside of their body. But more often, dissociation is just a way for us to disconnect from ourselves, disconnect from our body, disconnect from that awful feeling in our heart and our gut as we're experiencing grief. It's like a circuit breaker that cuts power to prevent the damage from an electrical surge. Well, there is an emotional surge that can happen that can feel overwhelming. And so dissociation cuts off that intensity designed to protect us from emotional overwhelm. And so as we look at our experiences, have you noticed times when you've checked out, zoned out, felt disconnected? Maybe you're present physically, but you're not present mentally or emotionally. And that is a form of our body's protection mechanism and a sign that we have stored trauma patterns in our nervous system. And if you are experiencing that with grief or the people that you work with, you're noticing that as you talk to them about grief, they're kind of checked out. Well, this is their body in a trauma response as it relates to feeling the overwhelm of grief. Time can feel like it slowed down. Feelings feel disconnected. We can feel disconnected from our surroundings and even our emotions. We can feel numb or flatlined. These aren't signs that there's something terribly wrong. It's actually the body is doing what it was intended to do in order to protect us from the intensity of what would otherwise be overwhelming. But let's look at the second survival mechanism that the body experiences in a trauma response as it relates to grief, and that is the immobilization. We feel stuck, we feel paralyzed. It can feel like we've fallen into a well and there's no way out. That's the immobilization aspect, where we're not feeling like we can move through things. We're not feeling like we're making progress. It's just the weight of it, and the weight feels like it is paralyzing at times. That's what it can feel like when something feels unbearable. If we're not able to feel it, we're not able to move through it. And that stuckness is an aspect of the immobilization. Emotions can get stuck. Emotions such as fear or shame or the heart shock, if that was associated with one's grief, not just the loss, but the sudden, unexpected shock that can be connected with loss. And that makes that form of grief some of the hardest to move through because of this aspect of immobilization and paralysis that the shock itself causes. And then we can look at that third element, the energy conservation. And this explains the exhaustion, the fatigue, where one can sit on the couch for hours and be perfectly fine with that. And that is not how we would normally be. When we are feeling healthy, when we are our best selves and in our best health, we are creatures and beings that move. And when that energy conservation piece comes in, that's happening at the biological level. And it will make it so hard for us to have the energy to move. Why? Because our body has moved into a place where it is prioritizing the energy for our survival. And if it's not absolutely necessary for our survival, well, then we're just not going to use the energy for that. And so everything can start to feel hard and we can feel like we're treading through mud every day. And so if you're working with people with grief, one of the questions that I like to ask them that you might want to ask them is, how has your energy changed through this process? Does it change throughout the day, or are you always feeling depleted and with low energy? Are all of your activities feeling depleting, or are there some practices that fill you up? And oftentimes, our body is so deep in the trauma response with grief that there's nothing that feels like it is invigorating. There's nothing that feels like it fills up our cup. And that's normal. That is part of the body being in that shutdown place with the trauma response. And that is why grief can physically feel heavy. We often refer to grief as a burden, and it feels physically heavy. Our body, our heart can feel like it's literally sinking in our chest with grief. And that's also because of what's happening in the diaphragm and the gut, where it doesn't have that tone that it normally would to help the heart feel like you're being held up. And so these are changes that are happening inside of our biology that's creating these physical symptoms that we think that they might just be emotional if we don't understand the biology behind it. Let's talk about shutdown for a moment. Shutdown is this aspect of the trauma response that's so prevalent in grief. And when we can recognize it, we know how to meet someone there or meet ourselves there if we're going through this. Shutdown is a very different state than the stress response. And so are they are they need different things. The stress response needs energy and support. The shutdown just needs peace, safety, silence. It everything is already too much. And so just like a hibernating animal slows everything down, that's what it can feel like to be in shutdown. Our body powers down in order to survive. And so these three survival mechanisms are part of that shutdown. It's the dissociation, the immobilization, the energy conservation. And what's fascinating is that this has been seen at the cellular level. And Dr. Robert Navio has illustrated the cell danger response and literally can look on microscope how cells, and specifically mitochondria, when they're in the stress response, they're hunkering down to be able to make more energy, make it fast to help us take action. And when it becomes too much, when a cell or mitochondria crosses that line of overwhelm, that's a very different response. And now things are falling apart. It's not in that hunkering down and we're doing our best. Things are falling apart. And that's that equivalent of the shutdown in the trauma response at the cellular level. And so, as we look at how do we support our body to come out of grief, if this is where we find ourselves or someone that we're helping, we need to bring energy into the system. We need to support and repair the biology. And so, repairing the mitochondria will be one of those aspects. We also will need to repair the gut, the damage of what happens when we are in that shutdown place and the messages coming down our vagus nerve are telling everything in our gut to stop working, just to slow down and to shut down. which what happens is the leaky gut, and we're developing inflammation and food sensitivities, and that's traveling to our brain, and now we're having the brain fog. So the gut will also need repair in grief. And I will be sharing a supplement guide that I've used to repair the gut and grief because of how important that will be in order to promote the healing journey. But as we stop and reflect, what messages might the body be trying to communicate through these physical symptoms? Everything is a message. The body holds so much wisdom. So, in these physical symptoms, when our gut is in pain and bloating and our digestion is off, what is the message? If our heart feels like it's sinking in our chest, what is the message that our body is trying to communicate through these physical symptoms? A lot of this would be the message of this just feels like too much. It's just, it's all too much. And so, as we look at the mind, body, and biology and how it all connects, we can see how the emotions, the physical health, the symptoms, and the changes at the biology level all will need to have repair as we look at moving from experiencing grief to the grieving process that we discussed in the longer episode with Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. We do go into the brain chemicals that will possibly also need some repair, like serotonin, dopamine, GABA. And so these are things that I do have included on that grief and gut health supplement guide, if that would help you. So, the gut. Let's take a moment and look at that because that has a strong relationship with how we cope with grief. And maybe this has been your experience, whether you personally or those that you work with, but oftentimes a person ends up using food to help cope with grief. And how has our relationship with food and eating changed during a time of grief? Do we notice that particular foods feel more helpful in numbing our emotions? Do we find ourselves gravitating to certain foods as opposed to others? Do we know why? Has our eating patterns, rhythm been disrupted during times of emotional pain? There is so much insight that we can gain when we look at these aspects of grief, specifically in the relationship with our food and eating. Because there are specific gut patterns that emerge during grief, and we talk about the decreased digestion, absorption, dysbiosis, or the imbalance in the gut bacteria, the disruption of the lining of the gut, and so developing of foods and substances passing through that wall that are not supposed to enter into our bloodstream. And so this is all what can be happening when we're experiencing grief and we notice digestive changes along with our grief experience. So what do? Let's break it down. We do want to establish a rhythm for our body. Our body thrives on rhythms, schedules, and so we want to establish some type of rhythm, even from our circadian rhythm to our eating rhythm. Eating generally at the same time every day in a calm environment. If you've learned some somatic practices, you can use those while you eat in order to create that inner safety for your gut and your vagus nerve to be communicating safety while you're eating to your gut. We want to also support stomach acid because that's what helps break down food and decrease the downstream effect of larger particles of food traveling into our intestines, where then they cause more of the damage to the lining of the intestines. So we want to bring in some stomach acid if that would be helpful, even enzymes to help break down proteins and the fats and carbohydrates so that we are supporting the initial part of digestion. You might consider digestive bitters or apple cider vinegar before meals, particularly if you feel that when you eat, the food just kind of sits there, which is a common description for those patients of mine who've been stuck in their grief. But then we want to actually repair the gut. So we're going to be using nutrients like L-glutamine, zinc carnosine, to help repair the intestinal lining that becomes compromised during a trauma response like overwhelming grief. We also want to support our microbiome, so we want to add a few specific types of probiotics and make sure that we are drinking lots of water and ensuring at least twice daily bowel movements to be eliminating the toxins that would otherwise build up. So, in conclusion, understanding the biology behind grief offers us profound insights because what feels like unbearable emotional pain is actually happening at a deeper level in our biology. And it's a mechanism that is designed to protect us from overwhelm and yet can make it harder to heal and move through grief because of all of the inflammation and the digestive damage that's happening. And so, as I discuss in my book, your body has been trying to protect you all along. And even if those are symptoms of heaviness, fatigue, feeling disconnected, even the digestive changes, these are all ways in which our body is actually trying to protect us. Yes, it does that by shutting down, and that doesn't feel helpful, but they are evidence that your body is still doing its best to fight for life. I encourage you to go back to the longer episode with Dr. O'Connor because we shared the difference between grief and grieving. We talked about attachment styles and how that will affect grieving, the neurotransmitters, and how the yearning that is part of craving is connected to these different brain chemicals. With that, I want to end with encouraging you that it is possible. Healing from grief is possible, and you can do it. Thank you for joining me. I'm Dr. Aimie, and I look forward to exploring more topics with you as we look at the profound connections of our mind, body, and biology.